Hey, welcome back to the Manufacturing Know-How Podcast. I'm Don Rahrig, CEO of Rain Engineering, and we're excited to bring you this second episode of our discussion around FSMA 204 and how MES solutions can help food and beverage manufacturers simplify compliance to the new standard. If you missed our first episode, we covered fundamentals of FSMA 204, the requirements, and the challenges that manufacturers face in achieving compliance. Today, we'll dive into the specifics of how information flows into MES and the tools within Proficy Smart Factory to trace materials and track processes as ingredients and materials are transformed in the manufacturing process. Let's get started. Today, I have with me Scott Butler, the manufacturing coach from FSO Institute, Joe Gerstl, Senior Director of Manufacturing Software at GE Vernova, and Chris Carlins, Chief Technology Officer here at Rain Engineering. Thanks, guys, for joining us. Let's jump right in. Hey, everybody.
Great. Yeah, everybody.
Let's set the stage. Let's briefly revisit the core challenges that FSMA 204 presents for food and beverage manufacturers. As we discussed in the first episode, FSMA 204 is part of the FDA's Food Safety Modernization Act, focusing on enhanced traceability and data transparency throughout the supply chain. Manufacturers now have to track key data elements, KDEs, and critical tracking events, CTEs, to ensure end-to-end traceability. But here's the catch. Most legacy systems aren't equipped to handle volume and complexity of the data, let alone deliver real-time data during FDA inspection or recall event. So we know the compliance date is January of 2026. Let's jump right into today's episode. Scott, would you like to introduce yourself or say hello and then start with the questions?
Yeah. Again, I'm Scott Butler. I'm with the FSO Institute, manufacturing coach. I've been in the industry for 30 plus years and both quality management, regulatory management, and operations. I think one of the interesting things, obviously, you just mentioned January 20th, 2026, which is a bit less than a year from now. But there's been some other activities in our industry, and we're seeing that some companies are moving a little quicker than the FDA is in this regard. And two major retailers on the retail food side, both Kroger and Walmart, have elected to move quicker than the FDA to comply. And Kroger has set a date of June 30th of 25, and Walmart August 1st of this year as well. So not too long in the future. These two retailers represent over 35% of the total retail volume in the United States. So their decisions in this regard are pretty significant to the industry.
Scott, is that normal for a retailer to take a more aggressive stance and try to get out ahead of these things, or is this new behavior?
I don't think it's totally new behavior. I think they do try to get their supply chain in compliance prior to when they need to comply. So any kind of hiccups can be worked out sort of ahead of the process. Where it might be a little unusual is they've also expanded the scope of compliance to all the food and beverage products that they distribute. Whereas FSMA 204 had a much smaller subset of products, high risk products, as they refer to them on their food traceability list. And, I'm sure it's making their operations somewhat more concise in the terms that they don't have to have two different systems in place. But on the other hand, just from a general food safety and to their consumer, I think they see this as a necessary move.
I bet the FDA was going to add other foods anyway, so it makes sense to just do them all at once.
Yeah. The other interesting thing that people need to keep in mind is that this applies to both internationally produced and domestically produced products. So again, they're painting with a pretty broad brush, both at the FDA level and at major retailer level.
So Proficy Smart Factory has had the capability to trace products through the manufacturing process really since its inception. Can you guys talk about at a high level the processes in place within Smart Factory to track ingredients and materials used to produce a finished product?
Yeah, sure. I can kick it off. Proficy Smart Factory is really flexible. So we actually handle a lot of types of manufacturing, but we're especially good at food and beverage, consumer packaged goods, stuff like this that we're talking about. So where it all starts is receiving. The raw materials come in and you scan in the raw material, you put in a location. Now that's probably done in your ERP, but you could do it in Proficy Smart Factory as well through the receive inspection module, where you could test the raw materials and make sure they're up to quality standards that you need before you consume them. And then once you're sure that that material is usable, then the operator consumes them through the bill of material definition that is associated with the product that you're making, and then just follows through the steps of the process. But the consumption of the bill of material is kind of key to this conversation that we're having right now. Now, it doesn't all be automated, right? So most customers do actually, because you're in a sort of a semi-continuous process type manufacturing where you don't really stop in between runs, and generally you kind of blend things together and do clean in place and things like that. So yeah, there's a lot of things that Proficy can do in that regard, like time-based genealogy and based on some equation, knowing what material you put 3 batches in your hopper and maybe you consume them at a certain rate. And therefore you can kind of guess what batch you're consuming. Now, Chris and I were talking, this is going to get a lot harder, right, Chris?
That's right. I figured we could start off with a simple example, and then as we work through the conversation today, we can explode it out. So, talking about Walmart and Kroger really pushing for a larger amount of manufacturers to get involved in this, I figured we'd still start off with something like heads of lettuce being shredded and then put into bags for easy made salads. So if we start with a simple process where we have a pallet of heads of lettuce coming in, it goes through a couple of different machines. So if we have the machines being something that's going to clean, something that's going to shred the lettuce, something that's going to bag it, and then palletize it, right? So simple process of making something and then packaging it. Obviously, Smart Factory was built for things like that. And so in that process, just to kick things off here, you're indicating like if all you have is a simple process where you're doing a 1-for-1 and you're processing the heads of lettuce and then they're palletizing them, the ability to track that through a manufacturing execution system like Proficy is pretty straightforward. We would monitor what's happening at each one of those machines, whether it's the machine that's cleaning it, we scan the material in, it goes through the cleaner, then through the shredder. Each one of those, we're monitoring when that event starts, when it ends. And we also have the ability to acquire any automated information that's coming in from the process when we call about those key elements. But we can monitor either the temperature of the machine itself, or if it's just more about the environment that the process was in when they were running in, we could take the temp as well from the environment. And so it's just following those process variables that are happening at the cleaner, the shredder, the bagger, counting how many bags are made as they're being put onto the palletizer. And then for each one of those steps, we know when that event starts and ends. And we can also then match quality information against it if samples are taken from a particular part of the process. So that's my simple example. And Joe, what you were hinting at is what happens when we're continuously in our current manufacturing process, dumping things into a hopper where we don't have that simple 1-for-1 where we know where one lot ends and the next one begins. It's somewhere between a technology challenge and a retool of how the processes are being made to make those clear-cut delineations.
Yeah, exactly. And there are things we can do to help with that too, right? Maybe there's 3 batches in a hopper and you could tag all 3 batches as if they were going into a particular pallet of chopped lettuce. That would work too. You wouldn't have to necessarily know exactly which batch, and you wouldn't if you had all 3 in a hopper, but you could tag all 3 of them and say, hey, just in case there's some contamination, at least I know a much smaller subset of material that I worked on, right? So definitely can be done, but I agree with you. It's probably a physical process change in some cases. Depends on the manufacturer.
One of the things that we like to do to new manufacturing processes is to analyze what are the requirements, what does the manufacturing company need? And in this case, knowing that they need that traceability right at the beginning of an assessment, we'd be able to identify the areas where there's positive, clear-cut examples of being able to trace things through. But then we'd also want to have conversations about what might need to be changed in the process, maybe some additional sensors or connectivity to bring in that data so that we can have enough information to put the entire story together. So the final thing I'll say about it is that we have these different machines, and just built right into Proficy is the ability to track as it's going from one machine to the next, just how much material went through and how it's scanned. It's built into the product, the software solution, to give you that level of traceability. We can talk more about that too as we go through.
Yeah, you kind of building a digital twin, essentially, the factory and all the equipment and the flows of the material through the equipment. So, yeah. Don't you guys at Rain have digital transformation process or something like that?
Yeah, Joe, thanks for bringing that up. We do have a 6-step process for digital transformation. We call it our manufacturing know-how 6-step process. And it just really starts with so many times we've been engaged by manufacturers during their search for features and functionality in manufacturing software. In many cases, we get engaged when there's a demonstration so that the engineers or the leadership or the compliance people can get an idea of features and functions of a software so they can decide what their requirements are going to be. But we've refined a process, and it's not unusual, and it's a process most companies go through. They just seem to go through out of order. So this first step of the 6-step process is to define your goals and communicate them across the team that will be responsible for building the system or delivering the system and participating in getting the users on board. So defining those goals, communicating those goals, and really that starts with the company's leadership and boils down to the plant um, on a case by case basis. But then after goals are set, you have to take on a little bit of analysis of where you are and you do a evaluation of the shop floor, look and see what data is already flowing. What systems are you already using to maybe manually input data? Consider clipboards, consider all the things people use to gather the information that ends up solving the problem or automating the process. And then you go to step 3 and really do that gap analysis between what goals do you have to achieve? What are the priorities of those goals? And what systems have to be augmented or replaced in order to achieve those goals? Once you have the gap analysis in place, you can produce a roadmap and then work together as a team, whether with an outside vendor or just an internal team to develop the use cases. How are we going to use this system? How will we engage with the system on the shop floor? How will leadership engage with the system? Reports and things like that out of it. And then use those use cases to go to the different vendors and ask for demonstrations and features and functions. So it helps you define what you're going to go ask your vendor for long before the vendor ever shows up to do a demo. So we find ourselves that a lot of times when a customer asks us to come do a demo, resetting just to make sure they've been through the previous steps. And then finally, the 6th step really is setting up the execution methodology. What's the plan to get from where you are to where you're going? It's an important part of the process, definitely for all manufacturers.
Yeah. So are those goals that you set, are those usually financial goals or are they?
So sometimes the goals start with something the CEO puts in the annual report, right?
Right.
Do you have a sustainability goal? Or let's use FSMA 204 as an example. So there's a new regulation. We've been able to meet regulations with paper processes and clipboards in the past. We need more automated data from the shop floor, and we need an MES in order to compile all that data and give us the traceability element. So we communicate the goal, hey, we have to be FSMA 204 compliant, and then consider all the things that go into that as we do the shop floor evaluation. What are the systems we're using today? What has to be automated? How are we holding and maintaining and recalling the traceability when we get audited? Those kind of things. So you get into the sub goals. You look and see what you have. You look and see what you don't have and where you might need to make changes to the systems you have and such. And then when you go to build your use cases, you talk about how you want it to work. Like, what is the ideal scenario to having that work? So in terms of your question about goals, it can start at executive level, but sometimes it can be after the goals have been permeated through the system. So we commit to being compliant. And ultimately where you end up is we have to be FSMA 204 compliant by January of 2026.
Yeah. In this case. Yeah.
So food manufacturing operation could sometimes have hundreds of ingredients and materials that are received into the facility, and you have to produce dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of finished goods, right? So describe the capabilities that the Proficy Smart Factory tools have that assure that all the FSMA 204 traceability information gets, for each of the ingredients, is recorded and available to support traceability in case of a recall.
Yeah. So we talked about some of this already, right? The first step is bringing the raw materials in, and you can use your ERP or you can use Proficy Smart Factories to do receipt inspection tests and quality tests and so forth. And of course, you can consume things via barcode scanner. You can type them in if you want, but we're also very good at connecting to equipment and pulling that data directly off the equipment if the equipment has it. So you probably wouldn't have a lot number on the equipment. You'd probably barcode scan that. but you might have some quality testing that you're doing, and maybe the equipment has some sort of ability to tell you the pH of the lettuce or something that we could read from there. So we're really good at taking manual data, process data from, say, a time series database, like the one we offer called Proficy Historian, and even combining that data, right? So you might do a calculation that says, I have this information that somebody typed in, I have this information from the machinery, and I can put it together and come up with a calculation that tells me, hey, I'm out of spec or whatnot. So that's another big thing that we do. For every bit of this data you track, you can have specifications on that data. So, whether it's on target, whether it's in a warning area, or whether it's a reject that this is bad material, or this part of the process, the material went bad, or whatever it might be, you can track all that through there, including SBC and other trends. But, in case of FSMA 204, we're really talking about genealogy. And that's something that Proficy Smart Factory has done for years and is really good at. We touched on it earlier when we talked about time-based genealogy, where you have consuming multiple lots together, but that's doable. But again, you might need to look at your processes in light of the new FSMA 204 requirements. Proficy Smart Factory is very flexible.
One of the things that I've always appreciated about Proficy is I never felt as an integrator that I was going to hit a dead end. What it really comes down to is whatever your process is, the idea is how do we take that process and digitize it so it ends up in Proficy? And what Proficy has at its core is a set of structured tables. So every time you run a process through a machine, let's say when you're shredding the lettuce, we represent the shredder in the plant model. We know when the lettuce went in and went out. So we have a specific event time. And as Joe, you were describing the idea of however you have that data for the process information, if it's coming in automatically, if someone has to manually read the temperature at a certain time, the process data is going into a set of tables that are related to that machine when that lettuce was shredded. And we know the lot of material that went in because of the powerful genealogy that's built into it as well. So you mentioned the genealogy, you mentioned the process data. You also mentioned different ways that we can get quality data in. So it be just somebody writing down on a piece of paper, they did a test and then they write down that information against that event as it was running in that machine. They go back and write that quality information against it. You've identified also what we've done in the past, which is connect up to lab devices and actually allow someone to say when they're running a test, connect to the lab device, get the information into Proficy and let them say, I was running for this particular batch that ran through the shredder. So all the information is in there in one spot. And one of the other things that Proficy excels at is its robust recipe management system. So we can talk more about that as we go through, but knowing whether or not your process data is in spec and quality data, right away, so you can make adjustments. You can't inspect quality into a process. You have to recognize it as it's happening. And those are all some of the powerful things that we have in Proficy. For me, the biggest part about this is we still go to a lot of places that use paper and pen, right? People are walking in with smartphones, putting them down and then picking up a paper and pen. And what we're having with these most recent regulations is, here we are, 2025, it's time to make a difference, right? And so even if it's just putting paper on glass, we have the ability to do that. And so I want to emphasize that no matter how you have your data coming in for your process and quality data, if all you need to do is digitize it, and then you want to do more in the future, this is a great first step too. Proficy is here to really expand as you're ready to use it.
Yes, we see a lot of paper. You go out to manufacturing facilities, you're like, oh my God, I can't believe they're making this using a clipboard to write things on. And then it's getting transposed and somebody's fumble fingering it and getting the data wrong. And at no time in that entire series of events there, do they even know if they're in spec or not? Because you write a value on a piece of paper and it doesn't turn red when you're out of spec. You got to really know, I better go check, make sure this is in spec. So yeah, just digitizing adds so much value. Right? And then being able to do FSMA 204, I don't know how you're going to do it without digitizing.
I think there's a huge benefit of getting the clipboards off the factory floor. Joe, you mentioned usually there's a records review at the end of the day or something. That takes up a lot of person hours to go through. If you do detect a problem, where's the product now? It could already be shipped by the time you detect something in a record review. So making it all sort of real time is a huge side benefit of a good process management system.
It's something you don't necessarily see in the profit and loss statement, but it's a true value.
A lot of time saved, a lot of variability reduced, and a lot more access to real-time information. Instead of waiting for the end of a shift or a week, you have it right away. And now you can set alarms against things too, which is another thing we can talk about.
So, Joe, can Proficy pull ingredient traceability information from third-party tools and ERPs? And like, what are the ways to manage the incoming data that lives in other systems so that we don't have to rely on that sneaker net or that clipboard?
Yeah. We have an integration with ERP systems, and we don't really care what your ERP system is. Most of our customers use SAP, but it doesn't matter because we have integration mechanism to pull that data, like the material master, which could contain all the information about that material you're making or the raw material. And most of the time you don't have your specs in ERP, but once you pull them down to the MES, then you're going to put your targets, your limits, and so forth in there. And then, pulling, now that you have the material information, you can pull down the lot information, right? Lot 27 is now at line side, right? It's next to your equipment, ready to go, or maybe it's put in a hopper or whatnot. You can track that through Proficy Smart Factory, and you have different locations. And then, of course, the lots come in from the ERP, and there's no manual process to do that. And then, of course, consuming that, right? Because the operator is going to say, hey, I use this much, or the equipment's going to say this much flowed through the pipe or whatever it is. That consumption then goes back up to the ERP to say, I use this. Don't let anybody use the 27 gallons that I just used. So that's all done various ways. We have a set of integration tools. We also have just REST endpoints, which a lot of customers are going more to that. And we have a rich set of REST endpoints you can use. You can even do it simply with a flat file if you want to. We have that built in. We've been doing this for a long time, and there's many ways to do it depending on your level of complexity and your digital maturity, I guess I'll say.
Yeah, I'm going to stop you right there for just a second, because one of the key and most important things about Rain's business is that end-to-end capability, that from machine connectivity to integration to ERP and all the things in between. And I just want to take a minute to give a shout out to Proficy Smart Factory to just say, like, it's been around a long time, and all the ways it used to connect to things, it still connects to things. You can still use all the legacy ways of interfacing, and all along you're doing product development. That's your baby, right? You're the product guy. And so all along, I'm going to give you the credit for developing new REST endpoints in the API and maintaining in the product development all the ways we connected to legacy equipment and to legacy data sources. So just wanted to pause right there and talk about that, because I think everyone is afraid if I buy an MES, I'm going to have to change my process to the way that MES processes that data. And you guys have the flexibility of modifying business rules and changing the plant model and those kind of things. And at the same time, you have this whole menu of tools to handle legacy connections to equipment, modern connections to equipment, modern interfaces to other software, and connections to legacy software. So I think it's an important thing to talk about with Proficy.
We keep going, Don, too. I just got a call today about this and extending it even more. So yeah, you got to keep up with the times.
I want to say, I'm excited about the fact that some of the more mature forms that have been around for a while are being brought back around again. I know we'll have more access with what was available on the SDKs now being brought to the modern REST type standpoint. And the two things that we're talking about here, like I said, never feel put in a box, because there's always the idea of using intermediary tables or flat files to pass exact pieces of information between an ERP and MES or warehouse management tool, right? So we can use those basic ways of doing it. When we get into the REST endpoints and things like that, one thing I want to mention is that's where we have conversations with companies to say, is this going to be a good fit for you? Should we just start off with something simple like those file transfers? Because if your company has a middleware type integration, then that's going to really be an indication that you're ready to pass information from an ERP through those REST endpoints and get to Proficy and vice versa. So just a couple different things to discuss. Which we start off with now? How do we grow into something more? That's all part of those initial conversations when we're going through that transformation.
I almost want to say, Joe, earlier you kind of glossed over, well, many of our customers have SAP, but a lot don't. A lot don't have modern ERPs, and they shouldn't be afraid to leverage MES to get compliant.
Absolutely not.
And it doesn't matter whether you're still running your business with QuickBooks or not. MES can give you the features and functions with Proficy Smart Factories.
Yep.
So does Proficy have a tool that would alert the manufacturing team that the incoming ingredient is missing some requirement traceability or some requirement around traceability information?
So those variables that I talked about, where you collect them either manually or via the process time series database or any other system, like we just talked about with the integrations, right? Let's say an operator had to enter some data. We can make that a mandatory variable so that they have to enter the data before they can say that that particular, what we call an activity, is done. We also can track when they started entering the data, when they completed that activity. So the nice thing about that is now you can identify, oh, Bob's kind of slow here. Maybe you need some training, right? And you can kind of identify things that are going on in your plant that you certainly can't do on a piece of paper. So the other thing we can do is like change the actual, we call them production events when you're making something, and there's intermediate production events that go in between the equipment. There's also finally the finished good, of course, that gets made. And all of those events have statuses, right? Is it good? Is it inventory status? Is it consumed status? And all of the ways that product might flow through the system, we have a way to track all that and control it and really understand where things are. Oh, I can't use this one because the status is reject or something like that. So that all can be taken care of.
So if the system is flowing, forget for a minute what product we might be making, but the system is flowing and at one process step, a critical variable value is missing or out of spec. The product has continued to flow through the system, right? It may be a continuous or a batch process and it continues to flow through the system. The things that you just talked about, those event statuses can tell us in a much closer resolution or much more fine resolution, where is that product? How far has it gotten without being compliant? And whether it's a recall or not, you get to a place where you can react to it. And really, that's the whole thing, right? That's the whole ball of wax for MES, at least in terms of FSMA compliance. So individual ingredient cases, pallets, bulk containers will often be labeled with industry standard barcode. Does Proficy have the capability to interface with barcode readers to help log incoming ingredients? I know we kind of talked about it, but I just want to make sure that we cover that.
Oh yeah, we should swing back to that. So we certainly can read the barcodes. It's not a problem. Our mobile screens, they actually can use the camera on your device. If you have an iPad or an Android tablet or something, you could scan it with the tablet. There's actually a little icon that you click on, it scans it in. We can read lots of barcode styles. And if you need to parse the barcode, maybe like a 2D barcode or something, maybe there's an order at the front and then some serial number in it or whatnot, we can parse that so that if you need to do that, maybe pull out some information and use it for your genealogy or whatnot. You might want to print barcodes. In fact, part of the FSMA 204 is that you have to, and Scott, correct me if I'm wrong here, I believe like you have to print specific data on the label, right? That gets shipped to the Walmart or
both FSMA and the retailers will have specific barcode formats, and not FSMA per se. The government doesn't require it, but your customers are going to have a specific format that they're going to want to see that information in.
They'll have the format, but isn't there something in FSMA 204 where you have to have certain data on that label?
Yes, you're correct.
Yeah. So the great thing about Proficy Smart Factor, again, is all that data is already there. It's just sitting there waiting for you to use it. Now, the Proficy Smart Factor is what we call open and layered. So we talked to all kinds of stuff. We touched on that before. That includes barcode label printers, right? So we don't get into formatting your barcode. That's just not something we want to be in. There's plenty of people that do that. There's Bartender, there's Loftware, there's Zebra. They all do that. They have great systems to format your barcode. We would feed the information they need into the barcode system such that it can print the proper label. So again, another reason that it's great to digitize, right? I don't have to type that stuff from a piece of paper into Bartender or something and print out a label. I can interface it and just give Bartender, say, a file or call it with a REST endpoint or whatever mechanism that particular vendor uses. That's no problem at all.
The power of Proficy and, I'll be honest, just all commercial off the shelf software is it's getting the data into a structured database, right? And Proficy certainly has one of the more powerful ones out there. It's ready to handle the full MES, getting the advertisement for efficiency, quality, tracking, discrete, batch management. But what my point of saying that here is that rather than typing information directly into a single use piece of software is let's just get everything that we know about a particular process into a set of structured tables that are meant for it. And then however you need it to come out, whether it be a barcode, a report, an Excel spreadsheet that is needed for FSMA for it, it's all ready to provide that to you, especially when it's a standard. That means we can have one entity structure the information and push it out, then everyone can take advantage of it. So that's no matter how your process is on the plant floor, the idea is to get it standardized.
And I'll just take a quick second to mention we're adopting new technologies, kind of going back, getting the data out, not just for labels, but you might want to analyze the data, right? You might want to put it through some analysis, put it in your spreadsheets or whatnot. We have Excel tools that you can plug right into Excel, either on your machine, on your laptop, or if you're using Excel online, our tools work in there too. And you can easily pull that data out to do analysis and identify areas where you could do improvements and so forth. So there's a lot of ability there. In fact, I'll geek out for a second here again, Don, if you don't mind. We are about to release something called our GraphQL connector, which is going to make life even easier to build your own screens in our visualization tool, which is called Operations Hub. It's part of Smart Factory. And it's all about relationships and making things easier to understand relationships. And so now we'll have this new technology here in May that allows you to use it to speed up the ability to write your own screens. Proficy Smart Factory, as you guys know, comes with dozens of out-of-the-box screens. So you can get up and running pretty fast. Chris, would you agree?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But everybody's got something that's a little unique. And you've seen the Operations Hub. We have this visualization tool that you can speak to it, Chris, how easy it is to get data on a screen that you need. Well, we're about to make it even easier with the GraphQL.
Hey, Joe, you've said May now twice, and you keep alluding to some features and functions. What's significant about May?
May is when we release Proficy 2025.
Yeah.
So Proficy Smart Factory 2025 comes out in May, and this will have several new capabilities that we're really excited about.
Yeah. We talked about a lot of great features and stuff that have been built into the product for years, but I want to give you a chance to talk about the fact that you're now in an annual release cycle where there's big things happening each and every year. So May is that target date.
Yep. I should mention when I say all those screens, just so you know, that's all web-based screens, right? Yeah. And this Operations Hub tool is visualization in web-based too. So it's modern technology.
Yeah, it took us a while to get there, but we're there, right?
We're there. Yeah.
All right. So when you're doing a trace back as a result of a quality concern or an investigation for a product recall, it's helpful to associate the actual process attributes with specific time that the production of a finished product happened, right? How does Smart Factory link specific lots of finished products to actual process parameters like temperatures, pressures, process, that sort of thing?
Yeah. Those are those variables I was talking about. So you can attach a variable to something we call a production event, as I mentioned before, or you can create your own events, like user-defined events that you can attach variables to, or say on a changeover, you want to capture some data, or say on CIP or CIL or whatever it might be, you might want to capture some data. You can create events for all that too. So those attributes, I think you use the term attributes or parameters, we call them variables, and you can track it on just about anything. And any variable can have a specification on it too, which again allows you to do some great things in terms of digital technology to say, somebody types in a variable or the data comes from the machine, you can identify it as red. And if it's out of spec, for example, if it's beyond the reject limit, either low or high, and indicate visually right to the operator, oh, wow, I got something to do here. The other thing you can do is you can put alarms on there. So you might have SPC alarms, right? And you can do X points out of Y. So let's say 3 points out of 5 are trending above the warning limit. Well, now I can know, oh, I better watch this because this is looking like it's going towards the reject. And so I want to pay attention to that. And then all of this stuff is available connected to these events that I talked about. And then there's a genealogy view of things. So when you get back to things like some sort of investigation, as you mentioned, or God forbid, a recall, you can look at the genealogy view and say what batches went into this batch and then what batches came out of that batch. And you can drill in back and forth on the various elements that made the final finished good. So that's all there too. Chris, you want to add anything?
I mean, you covered it, Joe. For me, again, I don't ever feel like we're backed into a corner, whether it's raw material, work in process, or finished goods. We're capturing things automatically, manually putting things in from users or getting from lab devices, ERP. And the whole idea of however we need to track the events, we'll have those. They're in standard tables so that when we need to come up with some kind of recall report, we make sure we make that report specific for what's needed and pull from our library. And then now you have that for whenever a recall is needed. It makes it super quick for when things are ready to come in. And yeah, just to double down on what you said there about alarms and especially SPC, right? We can always have an alarm whenever a spec is crossed, but PC alarms, you can actually tell the future. So if our temperature is slowly creeping towards a bad limit, but we haven't gotten there yet, we can say if it creeps towards the limit 3 in a row, then go ahead and set the alarm before we even cross that limit. And we're seeing that pattern happen. So those are the things we get with SPC alarms.
Yeah.
Try doing that on paper.
Yeah. And I think the other thing is when you do get into a recall situation, really speed is of the essence, especially if it's a food safety concern.
What did Chris tell us, Scott, from the time an event is identified and FDA or whoever the right authority is comes back to the plant, to the manufacturer to ask questions? What was that response time that they have to have? It's hours, right?
Yeah, it's 24 hours that you have to produce the information. But the reality today is sometimes that information takes days or weeks to get. And when you look at the whole supply chain and trying to get it back to the source of the issue to begin with, historically, by the time they figure that it's already expired, it's no longer part of this, but you just can't go through boxes of files fast enough to meet the need in that situation.
So FSMA 204 refers specifically to traceability data to be documented as key data elements and critical tracking events. How does Proficy deal with that requirement?
So these events I'm talking about, which lines up perfectly with the names, right? Critical tracking events. Any batch in the system can have process data that comes from the equipment or manual entry data, as we talked about already. You can also have additional calculations that you can merge together. So it's very helpful to identify kind of patterns that you might have. But all this data is now in the system, and FSMA 204 requires vendors to produce these key data elements and then the critical tracking events. That data is ready for you to take out of Proficy via the mechanisms that we just talked about. Could be as simple as something as reading it from SQL, or it could be using the new GraphQL connector, right, to go get that data and generating it. Or the way that I saw these FSMA 204 files, they're in Excel. So you could use the Proficy Excel add-in to go get that data and populate a spreadsheet like that for the FDA or whoever else might be asking for it. And those are things we're starting to put into the product where it's just automatically built in, like, hey, I want my critical tracking event report. Click. There it is.
Everything that's being asked for here is things that Proficy's been doing for decades. And it's about getting the data into the system. And then really what we're talking about here is a specialized way of looking at it to make sure the right set of data is coming out and being put into the right type of report. So yeah, from that standpoint, it's all about just understanding what are those critical events, what are those key data elements, and making sure that there's a report made for it. As this requirement continues to mature, the standards are going to come from there. Structured database like Proficy is going to be able to pump that out easily for everybody. And it's like, okay, so we have to do this because of regulation, but really it's something that every company should have done 5-10 years ago, right? We should already be digitized. We should already be off of paper. And so this is an exciting time for everybody to realize that though the regulations are here, it's really pushing into a world where you get more real-time response. You have better visibility, less burden on operators, where they're getting to get results from the system rather than having to feed into it. So it's an exciting time really to just get a head start on it. And so don't go out and buy a specialized thing that's just going to do that one dead end FSMA regulation. Look to something like Proficy that's going to be with you for the long run and really help you out with your manufacturing process.
That's a great point.
Hey, in podcast 3, we're going to talk more about how Proficy can even be used to support the transmission of data from the plant to the FDA and other regulatory agencies, as well as trade partners, like even just transmitting data when nothing's wrong, just the good data, right? Passing up and down the value chain. So Joe, Scott, Chris, thanks so much for the good conversation today. I'm looking forward to episode 3. If you have any questions or anything you'd like added to podcast number 3 or any topic you want to know more about, you can contact us through info@raineyng.com. And we are really glad to have hosted this session for for all of you today. So looking forward to episode 3. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Take care.